Michael takes a breather in the restroom. He'll need to head home and rest as he's come down with a fever and aches. His secretary hopes it's not the flu, but Michael is sure it is. He signs a deposition before heading out. He's so unwell that he requests from the receptionist at the hotel that he's lodged in that his dinner be brought up to his room for him. He's also so diligent, despite his health, reviewing the details of an open case assigned to him. He eventually has to go see a doctor who recommends 3 days of bed rest, but Michael has a trial starting the following day. A case about a horrible man who stomped his 7-month-old child into the afterlife. The physician, realizing that justice can't wait, prescribes something that would keep his system in check while he has to work. Michael turns up for work the next day. A man in a conversation with a woman labels him as the presiding 10-up judge, known for handing out sentences with a minimum of 10 years. Michael wants to use the restroom. He hears humming from the male's restroom, signifying it's occupied, so he goes into the female restroom instead. Meanwhile, Jourdwi joins the counselor in the male's restroom to gossip about Michael's fallout with his wife. They know he's been staying in a hotel instead of his house, and according to hearsay, has visited illicit places while intoxicated. They even talk about his possible replacement with the deputy prosecutor. Michael joins the others in the chambers room and casually explains to the hearing of the gossip that he's down with the flu, and the only late-night movement he made was to a pharmacy to get treatment. The assessor judge still tries to poke holes in the story, but Michael waves him and the topic off. In the courtroom, the man, who happens to be a court artist, and the woman from much earlier sit on the defendant's side. The man points out various features of the room, including the judge's seat and his associate's seat. Court is now in session, and the judge and his associates take their seats. The jurors' seats are still empty. The defendant enters the room, and Michael asks him to remain standing. He introduces himself as 27-year-old Marshall. His lawyer, Jourdwi, steps out to make a call, while the judge orders the clerk to read out the names of the jurors selected. The court artist tells the woman that the judge is in a sour mood and that anyone could easily face his wrath. He has a sketch pad he uses to make a detailed sketch of Michael. Outside, Jourdwi lets the person at the other end of the call know that jury selection has begun and he received an email. For an immediate reply, he'll need the email forwarded to a Francios. Jourdwi returns to the courtroom. The trial will have 6 jurors and 3 supplementary. Part of the 3 supplementaries is Ms. Dita, who seems to have Michael in a fix as he calls her to take a seat. Once the box is complete, Michael calls for a 15-minute recess. Back at the chambers, the litigants wonder why Michael has called a recess so early into the trial. It's usually later in the morning after the preliminary report or character exam. One of the associates, Fournier, identifies Michael as a close-off judge, the type to keep reports short and let the victim speak while the defendant witnesses. Within the 15-minute break, Michael uses the restroom. He then apologizes for the abrupt recess, stating he's fighting off the flu and needed to take medication, but they can now all reconvene. Michael reads a letter from the defendant, stating he didn't hurt his child, Melissa, and he will maintain his innocence. Marshall has refused cross-examination during the trial and will let his lawyer do all the talking on his behalf. Michael asks Marshall to take a stand. The letter was sent in June, and Michael wants to know if Marshall's mind has changed since then. It hasn't, but a character examination will still need to be carried out. Questions about his background. Michael tries to engage Marshall, but Marshall's response each time is that he didn't hurt Melissa. Michael tells him to sit and calls on Mrs. Elodie to carry out a character examination. Mrs. Elodie takes the stand and relays that Marshall has always had a problem with authority and the educational system. He couldn't cope and left vocational school, later discovering he was allergic to mites. A carpenter allergic to mites. Marshall's neighbors never noticed anything outstanding about him. Michael asks the jurors if they have any questions, but they don't. Marshall is giving the opportunity to rectify anything concerning the report laid on the stand, but all he has to say is that he still didn't hurt Melissa. Michael probes that his resistance to cooperate isn't putting him in the best light. He's risking possibly 20 years, but Marshall isn't moved. His final verdict is for fate to decide. Michael tries not to lose his patience, urging Marshall to come out with what happened on that fateful day. Marshall stays quiet, as if deliberating within himself. He keeps the court in suspense, just to finally reiterate that he did not hurt Melissa. Michael calls for a recess with the trial set to resume after lunch. Michael inquires from his assistant, Pauline, where the jurors are having lunch. She mentions the address, and he tells her he'll make a stop at home first. Michael is still fixed on Dita, watching her and the other jurors discuss and head out. He follows them behind, making sure they actually land at the destination Pauline gave them. Satisfied, he turns home. The dog greets him, then Therese, the nagging maid. Michael is in no mood for her and states he's here to see his wife. He would, however, prefer that Therese picks him good apples as he's kindly requested. On the steps, he meets a new housekeeper, Laura, who started at the beginning of the month. It depicts either he's not been home for a while, or his head has been in the clouds because he doesn't know who Laura is till he asks. Marie Claire, his wife, also meets him by the stairs, and he apologizes that he won't be able to kiss her because he has the flu. She affirms that he doesn't look too well and wants to know if he's receiving treatment. She'd call for him, and Michael wants to know why. She's seen their lawyer and their divorce process is speeding up. She's signed the sales agreement and will leave Saint-Omer by the end of the month. A mover came that morning to give an estimate, and she won't be able to move all the furniture to Honfleur. She emailed him a list of what she'd be leaving behind and wanted to know what he'd like to keep. Michael has to get back to her as soon as possible as she doesn't plan to spend another winter in the house. With the conversation over, Michael grabs his bag of freshly picked apples and heads out. Michael hurries back to the streets and spots the jurors still in Spey River having lunch. He takes out his phone and sends a text. The jurors are getting to know one another over their meal. Dita receives Michael's text asking if this is still her number, and she replies that it most certainly is. Things are definitely getting more interesting. In the course of introductions between the jurors, a supplementary juror named Nasera is in the company of her cousin who is her chauffeur because she failed her driver's test. Simone, another juror, offers to take over chauffeuring duties, but Nasera's cousin explains that won't be necessary as Nasera's husband can be controlling. Yassine picks offense. His duty to men is to clarify that Nasera has a protective husband, not a controller. Nasera's cousin tells him to mind the business that pays him. The atmosphere around the table is now heated, so Simone restores peace, handing over the baton to Dita for her introduction. She's 45, divorced with 2 kids, and is an anesthesiologist in Lille. She was born in Denmark, but is a French citizen and has lived in France for over 20 years. A waiter brings over glasses of beer for the table to keep the conversation going. At some point the table also has food. Yassine brings up the case and expresses his thoughts on Marshall being guilty. Marie-Jeanne disagrees, standing on innocent until proven guilty. Yassine insists that Marshall's initial statement to the police already covers that he's guilty, but Marie-Jeanne infers that Marshall might have been under pressure to admit to a crime he didn't commit. Simone reminds them that they took an oath, so the case is not up for public discussion. They're, however, allowed to talk about the judge, whom an unnamed juror refers to as a cold fish. Marie-Jeanne has heard Michael is an awful person, and Dita is intrigued, wanting to know how she's come to such conclusions. She explains that her in-law works as a security guard in the courtroom, and no one there can testify that the judge is their friend. Yassine feels they don't know Michael well enough to judge him yet, though. Judging the judge is quite ironic. Michael is informed the litigants have returned and they can resume their session. He gears up with a dose of aspirin. The court artist is back at work, painting Melissa's mom, who has now taken the stand. She's asked to relay the activities of that dreadful day, and she starts off with Melissa crying all morning because she was unwell and in discomfort. She'd even vomited up her bottle. Melissa's mom went out for a brief walk. When she returned, Marshall told her that Melissa had an accident. She doesn't remember him drunk like he'd told the police in his statement. She went into the bedroom and found her baby's face bloodied. Melissa was still warm. Marshall narrated to her how he'd locked the innocent in a storage unit so he could block out her cries. That clearly didn't work, coupled with Melissa being unwell with belly aches. She cried, and Marshall in return yelled at her from the other side of the door to be mute. Things are about to get really crazy from here. The report states that the police found no traces of blood anywhere else except the bed. Melissa's mother can't explain that. She didn't clean up, nor does she remember Marshall doing the same. She'd been against Marshall turning himself into the police because she believed it was an accident. In the report, though, is something more sinister. She'd connived with Marshall to possibly throw Melissa's body into the Liane River to make it look like an accident. Michael wants to know whose idea it was to get rid of Melissa's body, and Melissa's mom answers it was a joint decision from her and Marshall. She also argues that it wasn't a cruel one. Marshall and her wanted to bury Melissa, not throw her into the river. Michael questions her about the she'd overdosed on the next day, as the police had found her in a fix. She divulges that she'd taken sleeping pills and tranquilizers because she couldn't sleep. She can't remember if she took them before or after Marshall left. Michael inquires if any of the litigations have questions. The prosecutor steps up to confirm with Melissa's mother her statement regarding Melissa being a crying child, a noise quite irritating to both Marshall and Melissa. Dita also has a question. She'd like to know how far along Melissa's mother was at the time of the incident. Melissa's mother was 5 months pregnant and had a baby boy. He doesn't cry like Melissa, and everything is fine. He was born while Marshall, his father, was in prison and has never been in contact with him. The first witness takes the stand. Her name is Christine, a woman in her late 50s who runs a daycare and became particularly close to one of the children who grew up to become Jessica, Melissa's mom. She asserts that she was never a fan of Jessica and Marshall's relationship, as he came off as too domineering. More witnesses are called to the stand to verify their statements. Jessica and Marshall's neighbors, an older couple, can't decide what part of their house is partitioned from Melissa's parents' room. What they can decide on is that they usually heard noises from the house. Lots of non-stop crying and shouting that could make anyone lose sleep. The final witness called to the stand is Marshall's half-brother, who paints Marshall in the best light. He claims Marshall was like a father to him and never treated him like he was less. He believes Marshall has been accused wrongly and didn't hurt his daughter. Michael calls for a 15-minute recess. In the deliberation room, the jury discusses. They've noticed Jourdwi stream in and out, taking phone calls. They tag him and his client quite unusual, although inferring that a client that chooses to keep shut is better than a client that blabbers and could ruin an entire case his lawyer has been building in his defense. Dita gets a text from Michael asking if she would like to meet up after the hearing at the place where she and the other jurors had lunch. While she contemplates, Fourier relays that the prosecutor's card will be that Marshall was grilled for several hours, forcing him into a confession that may not be true. Pauline comes to tell Michael the trial will resume in 5 minutes. Dita has responded to his text and is fine with meeting up. A medical personnel takes an oath and elucidates that Melissa suffered from pyloric stenosis. This must have caused her stomach aches because she would have trouble digesting food. This also explains why Melissa threw up after being fed. Another medical personnel relays that Melissa did suffer blunt force trauma to her skull. Her skull was still in its most fragile state, and it's plausible that a blow from a shoe could have led to her demise. The personnel, however, can't say for sure if that's what actually happened, as there are other options of Melissa suffering from a bang from the door or an accident with a table's edge. With that, Michael adjourns the session to resume the following day at 9:30 a.m. Michael is in a hurry to leave, waving off any documents to sign to the following day, and we can all guess why. Dita is waiting for him at a booth in the restaurant. She remarks that she made sure to be discreet because it must be a scandal for the judge to be meeting up with one of the jurors. Michael informs that it's particularly not wise, but not against the law. Turns out that Michael had an accident that Dita is aware of. It affected his hip, and he admits he still feels dull aches in the area. He also hates having to climb the stairs and would prefer all his meetings to be kept at ground level. He orders mineral water, still countering the drinking allegations sparked by Fourier's earlier gossip. Michael is curious to know if Dita would have turned down being a juror if she'd known that he was the presiding judge. She promises that it would have changed nothing. People tried to discourage her, but she had this one friend that was a juror and talked highly of the experience. The friend wanted to witness firsthand what lawyers and judges experience, and Michael remarks that he's programmed himself to tune it all out once he leaves the courtroom and retires home. He asks if she has sentiments with her patients, and she affirms that she does. She constantly has her patients in mind. She comments on the red scarf he always wears, calling his dress sense obnoxious. He admits that his wife feels the same, but he wears it to somewhat draw attention from himself. Have people focus on the outside rather than the inside. He flirts a little, calling Dita elegant even when he's seen her in her smock. He seeks to know why she failed to reply to his letter, wondering if she received it in the first place. She did receive the letter, but thought it best not to reply. He recalls how he invited her for dinner afterward. It had been a double date with Dr. Millar and his wife because Michael was too shy to see Dita alone. Dr. Millar was the surgeon behind Michael's surgery and an awful partner for the double date, he and his wife. Dita remembers the day well, and Michael's manner of recalling it sends her into a fit of laughter. He spent the whole of that dinner watching her as he hadn't seen her in a month. He still remembers what she wore and how it made her look. After dinner, he sent her a text because he missed her, but she basically friend-zoned him, and it hurt. Dita feels he's being too intense. He met her at work, and now he's infatuated. She was only doing her job and didn't mean to have him drooling over her. She gets a text message from her daughter who wants to know when she'll get home. Her name is Anne and she's 17 years old. Dita admits that it's just her and Anne at home, no one else. Dita has a night shift at the hospital, and she goes about her job affectionately, taking patients' hands into hers to provide comfort. It's the same thing she did for Michael when he had the accident that made him fall head over heels for her. Dita gets home, and her daughter is there to welcome her. They have a healthy and fun relationship with Anne, full of compliments for her mother over dinner. Anne wants a gist on the trial, although she's most interested in what the couple in the trial wore. For her, clothes say a lot about a person. She noticed her mom put effort into her clothes to the trial, and she believes it's to turn heads. Dita denies this, and also can't afford to say too much about the trial. Anne pushes, only wanting to know what at least Marshall and Jessica wore. Dita comments that she wasn't paying attention. She'd been meaning to see Jessica's eyes, but Jessica kept them downcast. Marshall had also borrowed his harsh gaze into Jessica throughout the session. Anne believes this means that Jessica was the one who hurt Melissa. It doesn't add up in Dita's book. Why would Jessica hurt Melissa and Marshall take the blame? The next day comes and Simone spots and catches up with Michael. Apparently he made a bet with Juror 1 that he's excited about, eager to get to the courthouse to know if he won. When Michael gets to his office, he finds Pauline stocking up his fridge with champagne. The jurors are in a festive mood. They made a bet over Juror 2 who wore combat boots to the previous session. Simone and Kerbiak made a bet over Juror 2 repeating the combat boots to the trial. The trial is delayed because one of the jurors, Coralie, is absent. In her absence, Michael informs the first supplementary Nasera that he'll call on her in the courtroom to take Coralie's place. Just before they enter the courtroom, Michael does notice Juror 2, and he's wearing his combat boots. Court is now in session, but before the hearing, Michael announces that Coralie will be replaced with Nasera. The first hearing for the day is of Jean-Michel, a police officer. He testifies that there are a lot of inconsistencies in Marshall's statements. Marshall claimed a door banged his daughter's head, but he can't remember if it was the bathrooms or the closets. He also claimed that he drank a lot that day. He later changed the story, saying Melissa didn't get banged with a door, she got stomped by his boot. Jean-Michel hadn't been in charge of questioning. That was all Captain Legal, who recorded that Marshall threw the boots afterward into the Lyon Canal. Captain Legal will be the next person to take the stand. Jourdui has a question for Jean-Michel, so the judge gives him the go-ahead. Jourdui starts off by asking Jean-Michel if he's new to the police force in Saint-Omer. Jean-Michel affirms that he joined a few days before the incident. It's his first murder case, and he admits it's the first time he's witnessed a long and intense interrogation. Jourdui pulls out the statement Jean-Michel supposedly took from Marshall. His argument is that the grammar on the paper is far too advanced for his client to have ever used. Jean-Michel admits he didn't take Marshall's statement word for word, and Jourdui uses this to plant doubt to the jury that Marshall's words might have been manipulated. Marshall, under the stress of grief, pressure, and questions with big grammar he didn't understand, could have confessed to a crime he didn't commit. Michael has a question of his own about the combat boots Marshall supposedly threw into the canal. When police first took his statement, he'd been wearing combat boots, insinuating he'd thrown the other pair into the canal. The police searched for the boots but couldn't find them. Michael confirms from Jean-Michel that he and the captain had failed to ask the defendant how many pairs of boots he has. They'd failed to examine the current boots Marshall had on at the time of the incident, because they could have easily been the same boots he claimed to have thrown away. Jean-Michel stutters and slips that the police did assume some stuff, including the possibility of Marshall kicking the Michael does what the police should have done. He asks Marshall to rise and state how many pairs of boots he owns. Marshall replies that he has one, the same one that was confiscated before he was thrown in prison. Now Michael needs to understand why Marshall told the police that he threw his boots into the canal. Marshall decides he's done answering and abruptly sits, causing whispers. Michael asks Jessica to rise and inquires from her how many pairs of boots Marshall owns. After much hesitation, she reveals he has just one. With that, Michael calls for a 20-minute recess. The jury goes to the deliberation room with the boots at the center of the discussion. Fourier explains that the boots hold no weight, and Michael only used it as a tactic litigates no as a coup de théâtre, used to spur debates. Michael soon comes in with words of advice. He tells the jury the trial will conclude the following day, after their deliberation. They should also know that only Jessica and Marshall have the true story of what happened to Melissa. The rest of them shouldn't lose sleep over what exactly happened. They shouldn't let it haunt their dreams. Their role as a justice system isn't to bring out the truth, but to reaffirm the principles of the law and punish defaulters. Marshall's fate is in their hands, but it doesn't change that Melissa is gone. The prosecution will most likely appeal in a year or two, evoking another trial that might bring out the truth. Jean-Michel confronts Michael about his interrogation, but Michael holds no sentiments. Jean-Michel did his job, and now Michael is doing his. Michael hurries to meet Dita at the diner, but she's not alone. Anne is with her. She'd skipped gym class to attend the trial because she was curious. She'd even filmed the trial, which Michael informs is strictly forbidden. It could annul the trial. Anne makes the table bubbly. She teases Michael and Dita for trying to play it cool when she knows better. They can be affectionate, she knows they want to. She eventually has to step away to take a call, and Michael uses the privacy to drop his best lines for Dita. He's truly fallen for her since his time at the hospital, and knows it's love. She'll cease to be a juror after the deliberation for Melissa's case, but he wants her to come to the court on the next trial because he wants to feel her presence while he works. The jury casts their vote, and the court finds Marshall not guilty. After Marshall's release, Pauline commends Michael for how he'd handled the case. There's a new trial, and Michael gets to work. 6 jurors are selected at random, and the rest are asked to either leave or stay. The jurors assigned to Marshall's case, among others, stand up to leave. Michael watches and his heart sinks when it seems Dita won't be staying. He tries to contain his hurt, but when he looks up again, she's returning to take a seat. As he recites the oath the jury will take, Dita shrugs off her coat, revealing the dress she wore to their double-date dinner. He can't take his eyes off her as he runs through the rest of the oath.